She was 16 years old, and she had nothing. Not a roof, not a name anyone in Caldwell Crossing would claim, not a single soul willing to look her in the eye after the morning the county sheriff padlocked her father's homestead and rode away without a backward glance. Elias Voss, the land speculator who had quietly purchased her father's debt from the Territorial Bank 3 months after her father's funeral, had handed her $7.40, the sum total found in the tin box beneath the kitchen floorboards, and told her she had until sundown to clear off the property. She was 16. She had $7.40, and she had nowhere to go. It was a station agent at the edge of town, an old man named Cully Marsh who smelled of tobacco and turpentine, who told her about the depot. The old Hargrove Stagecoach depot, he said, out on the Meridian Road, 2 miles past the cottonwoods. Abandoned for 11 years. Roof half-caved, floor rotted through in places, the company long dissolved. The county was selling it for $5 to clear it from the tax rolls. Nobody wanted it. Nobody had ever wanted it. She paid $5 for it that same afternoon, standing in the county clerk's office with her remaining $2.40 knotted in a handkerchief. And everyone who witnessed the transaction agreed it was the most foolish purchase they had ever seen a homeless child make. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, was what lay sealed beneath the depot's main floor. Something that had waited 11 years for the right pair of hands to find it. Something that would not merely change one young woman's life, but would restore the very soul of a valley that had quietly been losing itself for a generation. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nora Vane. If you have ever stood at the edge of something that felt like the end and found, instead, that it was the beginning, we would love to hear about it in the comments below. Nora Vane had not always been homeless, and she had not always been alone, though by the time she turned 16, it was difficult for her to remember clearly what the other kind of life had felt like. She had been born in the spring of 1878 in a 2-room homestead on the eastern flank of the Sweetgrass Valley, in the high plains country of eastern Montana Territory, where the wind came off the benchlands like a living thing and the grass ran silver in August like the surface of a slow river. Her father, Thomas Vane, was a man of particular and careful habits, a wheelwright by training, a homesteader by circumstance, and a reader of considerable depth by private inclination. He kept 3 shelves of books above the fireplace, and he read to Nora every evening from the time she could sit upright on her own, so that words became for her not ornamental things, but functional ones, the same way a well-fitted axle or a properly seated spoke was functional, necessary, load-bearing, meant to last. Her mother, Clara, had died of a fever when Nora was 4, and Thomas had raised his daughter with the quiet, methodical tenderness of a man who understood that the most important things are built slowly and maintained with daily attention. He taught her to read before she was 5, to do figures in her head before she was 7, and to keep a ledger, a real one, with columns and running totals and marginal notations before she was 9. He taught her that a record honestly kept was a form of truth-telling, and that truth-telling was not always welcome, but was always necessary. He taught her to identify the load-bearing elements of any structure, whether that structure was a wagon, a barn, or an argument, and he taught her that the difference between something broken and something ruined was usually effort applied at the right moment and in the right direction. She learned the wheelwright's trade alongside him, not because Thomas expected her to practice it, but because knowledge, he said, was the only portable property. You could lose land. You could lose livestock. You could lose a house to fire or a claim to a lawyer. But what you understood in your hands and in your mind traveled with you no matter what the territory took away. Thomas Vane was also a meticulous keeper of community records, in an informal way that certain men in small frontier settlements become the institutional memory of a place simply by paying attention. He knew who had filed what claim in what year, who had borrowed from whom, which water rights ran with which parcels, and how the original survey of the Sweetgrass Valley had divided the bottomland. He kept copies of documents that he considered important in a battered ledger he called his gray book, not because anyone had asked him to, but because he believed that a community without a memory was a community that could be robbed, and he had seen enough of the territory's history to know that the robbing, when it came, usually arrived wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase. He was right about that, as it turned out. He just did not live long enough to act on what he knew. Thomas Vane died of a lung infection in the winter of Nora's 14th year, quietly and without drama, in his own bed, with his daughter holding his hand and his 3 shelves of books watching from across the room. He left her the homestead, a team of horses, 2 cows, a working forge, the wheelwright's tools, and the gray book, which he pressed in her hands 2 days before the end and told her to keep safe above all other things. She did not fully understand why then. She was 14, and grief occupied the parts of her mind where understanding might otherwise have lived. She tried to run the homestead herself for the better part of 2 years, and she came closer to succeeding than anyone in Caldwell Crossing expected. She was capable with the forge. She could true a wheel and fit a hub and replace a broken tongue on a freight wagon, and word got around among the ranchers and freighters that the Vane girl could do the work her father had done, and do it well, and charge a fair price. She kept her ledger. She paid her taxes on time. She planted a kitchen garden and put up preserves and traded honest labor for what she could not produce herself. But the debt was the thing she could not see clearly, because Thomas had hidden it from her the way a sick man sometimes hides the worst of his symptoms from the people he loves, not out of deception, but out of a desire to protect them for a little longer from a weight they will inevitably have to carry. He had borrowed against the homestead 4 years before his death, during a dry year when the grass failed and the horses needed feeding and there was no work to be had. The loan had come from the Territorial Bank in Haverford, and it had seemed manageable at the time. But interest had compounded quietly, the way bad things in ledgers always do when no one is watching the right column. And by the time Thomas died, the debt was larger than the homestead was worth, and it had been purchased, quietly, legally, without Nora's knowledge, by a man named Elias Voss. Elias Voss was not a villain of the operatic variety. He did not twirl a mustache or deliver speeches about his own greed. He was, in the way of many men who cause great harm, simply a man of thorough and patient acquisitiveness who had identified the Sweetgrass Valley's bottomland as undervalued and had spent the better part of a decade assembling it parcel by parcel, using debt as his instrument and patience as his method. He bought distress notes from the bank. He waited. When the notes came due and the homesteaders could not pay, he appeared with paperwork and a calm expression and the law on his side, and he took the land. He had not singled Nora out for any particular cruelty. She was simply the last parcel he needed, and she was 16 and alone, and there was no one to stand beside her and say that what was happening was wrong. The sheriff served the papers. The clerk recorded the transfer. Cully Marsh, the station agent, watched from across the street and did not intervene because there was nothing legal he could do, and he was an old man who had learned the hard limits of what a single person with no authority could accomplish against a man with a briefcase and a judge's signature. $7.40. Sundown. Clear off the property. Nora stood on the road outside the homestead she had been born in, and she breathed very carefully for a long time, because she had discovered in the 2 years since her father's death that careful breathing was the thing that kept you moving when everything else suggested you should simply stop. She had the handkerchief with the money. She had the clothes she was wearing and the coat on her back. And she had the gray book tucked inside her coat against her ribs because she had kept it safe as her father had asked, and keeping faith with the dead man's last request was, in that moment, the only form of dignity available to her. Cully Marsh was the one who told her about the depot, and when she walked to the county clerk's office and paid her $5 and signed her name to the transfer deed in her careful, schooled hand, the clerk looked at her signature and then at her face and said, not unkindly, that she might want to think twice. The depot was falling down, he said. The Hargrove Company had dissolved in 1871. There was nothing out there worth having. I'm aware of that, Nora said, and took her copy of the deed and walked out into the afternoon. The Hargrove Stagecoach Depot sat on a meridian road like a thing that had given up arguing with the weather. The main building was a long, low structure of hand-hewn timber and cut stone, its roof sagging at the eastern end where crossbeam had finally surrendered to 11 winters of snow load and the patient entropy of abandonment. The windows were boarded. The great double doors that had once admitted four-horse coaches hung at angles from their iron hinges, admitting instead the wind and the sparrows and 11 years of accumulated dust. The yard was overgrown with bunch grass and rabbit brush, and the stone horse trough had cracked down the center, and the remains of the old corral fence lay in the grass like a sentence someone had started and then abandoned. Nora walked through it all slowly, the way her father had taught her to walk through any structure she was assessing, with her eyes moving from the foundation to the roofline and back, her hands touching the timbers to feel the difference between surface rot and structural failure, her feet testing the ground before committing her weight. The east end was compromised. The west end, where the stone walls were thickest, was sound. The main floor was pine plank over a stone foundation, and several of the planks had rotted through, but the stone beneath was solid and the drainage was good, and she could see from the way the structure had settled that the foundation itself had never shifted. She spent her first night in the depot's western corner, wrapped in her coat, with a gray book under her head for a pillow, listening to the wind move through the boards and thinking in the practical and sequential way her father had taught her to think about a problem. What is load-bearing? What is merely damaged? And what is the right order in which to address each thing? It was on the third day, when she was pulling up the rotted planks in the eastern corner to assess the extent of the damage and determine which boards could be salvaged, that she found the iron ring. It was set flush into the stone floor, blackened with age and coated in the accumulated grime of 11 years, nearly invisible unless you were down on your hands and knees in exactly the right light. She almost missed it. She would have missed it, she thought afterward, if she had not been Thomas Vane's daughter, if she had not been trained since childhood to look at the load-bearing elements of things, to look at what was beneath the surface rather than what was presented on it. She cleared the stone around the ring with her fingers, and then with a pry bar she found hanging on a hook near the old harness room, and she found the outline of a door in the stone. A trapdoor, perhaps 3 feet by 4, fitted so precisely into the surrounding floor that it was nearly seamless, and secured by a hasp and a padlock that had been locked and then painted over with the same whitewash that had once covered the depot's interior walls. The lock was old, but it was a good lock, a Scandinavian lever lock of a quality she had never seen on a frontier structure, and it did not yield to the pry bar. She sat back on her heels in the dust and studied it for a long time. Then she thought of the gray book. Thomas Vane had pressed the gray book in her hands 2 days before he died and told her to keep it safe, but he had not told her to read it. She had glanced at the first few pages in the weeks after his death and found them dense with the kind of notations he made, dates, names, parcel numbers, small marginal annotations in his compressed handwriting. And she had closed it again because grief had made her unable to attend to dense information and because some part of her had felt it would be an intrusion. The book had felt, in that period, like the inside of his mind, and she had not been ready to go there. She was ready now. She sat in the thin afternoon light that came through the gaps in the western wall, and she read the gray book from the beginning, page by page, in the careful and thorough way her father had taught her to read a ledger. Not skimming, not jumping ahead, but following the columns and the annotations and the cross-references in the order they were laid down, trusting that the pattern would reveal itself if she was patient enough to let it. It took her most of that day and into the evening. What she found was this. In 1868, 3 years before the Hargrove Stagecoach Company had dissolved, the company's regional director, a man named Aldous Crane, whom Thomas Vane had known and apparently trusted, had come to Thomas with a problem. The Hargrove Company was failing. The railroad was coming, and the stage lines that had once connected the territory settlements were becoming obsolete faster than anyone had predicted. Crane had in his custody a considerable sum of money, the company's final operating reserve, plus the personal savings of 11 of the company's employees, drivers, hostlers, station agents, who had been paid partly in scrip that Crane had been quietly converting to coin over the preceding 2 years against exactly this eventuality. The total, as Thomas had recorded it in his careful hand, was $4,380 in gold coin. Crane could not deposit it in the territorial bank because the bank was already entangled with the company's creditors and the money would have been immediately attached. He could not carry it with him, because he was heading into a legal situation in Haverford that he was not certain he would survive. There were men who wanted what the company had left, and Crane was not a brave man, but he was a careful one. He had arranged, with Thomas Vane's help, to seal the money in an iron strongbox and lower it into a vault that had been cut into the stone floor of the Hargrove Depot on the Meridian Road, a vault that Thomas himself had helped Crane design and that neither man had told anyone else about. The plan had been for Crane to return within the year, once the legal situation in Haverford was resolved, and retrieve the money for distribution to the employees whose savings it represented. He had given Thomas a key. Thomas had recorded all of this in the Gray Book, along with the names of the 11 employees and the amounts belonging to each one. Crane had never returned. Thomas had written, in the margin beside the final entry on this matter, a single sentence in his small, precise hand. I have made inquiries. Aldous Crane died in Haverford in the spring of 1869. I did not know what to do with this knowledge. I will think on it. And then, apparently, he had continued thinking on it for the rest of his life without arriving at a resolution, because there were no further entries on the subject. Only the names, the amounts, and the key, which Nora found pressed between the last 2 pages of the Gray Book, flat and dark with age, a small iron key on a short length of braided leather. She held it in her palm for a long time in the fading light, listening to the wind in the boards, thinking about her father and about the 11 people whose savings had been waiting in the dark beneath this floor for 11 years, and about what it meant that the world had arranged things so that she, of all people, was the one who had ended up here. She tried the key the following morning, and it turned. The vault was cut from the living stone, roughly 4 feet deep and lined with fitted stone on all 4 sides. The iron strongbox sat at the bottom, and it was heavy enough that she needed the pry bar to lever it up to floor level. The lock on the box matched the key, the same maker, she thought, the same Scandinavian provenance. And when she lifted the lid, she sat very still for a moment, looking at what was inside. The gold was in canvas sacks, each one labeled in a hand she did not recognize. Crane's hand, she supposed. The labels bore names. 11 names, 11 sacks, and beside the sacks, wrapped in oilcloth, a separate document. A letter in Crane's handwriting that explained, in formal and careful language, what the money was, who it belonged to, and that it was to be returned to its rightful owners, or, in the event of their deaths, to their nearest living heirs. She did not count the money that morning. She closed the strongbox and lowered it back into the vault and replaced the trapdoor and sat for a very long time in the dusty western corner of the depot with the Gray Book in her lap, thinking about load-bearing elements and the right order in which to address things. The first thing she addressed was finding paper and a pencil, which required a walk into Caldwell Crossing, which she made that afternoon. She spent 3 cents of her remaining $2.40 on a small notebook and a pencil from the dry goods store, and she walked back to the depot and began to make a list. 11 names. She knew some of them. Cully Marsh was one. Old Cully, the station agent who had told her about the depot, who had watched from across the street when Elias Voss's sheriff had put her out of her home. His name was in the Gray Book, and the amount beside it was $310, which was, she understood immediately, the reason Cully Marsh was still working as a station agent in his old age, rather than living in the comfort that a man of his years had earned. It was Cully himself who became both her problem and her first ally, because when she went to him, carefully, quietly, on a Tuesday morning when the station was empty, and told him what she had found and showed him the Gray Book and the letter in Crane's handwriting, the old man sat down very suddenly on the bench beside the ticket window and did not speak for a long time. Your father knew, he said finally. He knew, she said. He didn't know what to do about it. I think he was afraid. Of what? Of the bank. Of us. Of what would happen to the money if the wrong people found out it was there before the right people could be told. Cully looked at the list of names for a long time. Then he looked at her. 2 of these people are dead, he said, but their families are still here. Most of them are still in the valley. He paused. Voss has been buying up the valley for 10 years. Half these families lost their places to him. I know, Nora said. If this money went to them, he stopped. They could buy back, she said, or they could leave on their own terms instead of his. Cully was quiet again for a while. Then he said, the bank is going to say it has a claim. Voss is going to say it has a claim. Every lawyer in Haverford is going to appear out of nowhere, saying someone has a claim. The letter is clear, Nora said. Crane wrote it clearly. These are private savings, not company funds. They were never the company's to begin with. She opened the gray book to the relevant pages. And my father recorded everything. Dates, amounts, names. He was a careful man. He was, Cully agreed, and his voice was rough with something that might have been grief or might have been the particular emotion that has no clean name. The feeling of a wrong that has lasted so long it has almost become invisible, suddenly becoming visible again. He was the most careful man I ever knew. The trouble came, as Nora had known it would, from Elias Voss. Word got out, not from Nora and not from Cully, but from the county clerk, who had his ear to every transaction in the territory and who owed Voss a favor, that the Vane girl had found something in the depot. Voss appeared at the depot on a Wednesday morning with 2 men and a lawyer, and he stood in the yard and told Nora, in the measured and reasonable tone he always used when he was doing something he knew was wrong, that anything found on a property purchased by a county tax sale might have legal encumbrances that complicated ownership, and that he was prepared to offer her $50 for the property and whatever she had found in it, and that she should think carefully before refusing. Nora stood in the depot doorway, and she looked at Elias Voss for a long moment, and then she said, "The county sold me this property clear of encumbrances. The deed says so. You helped write the county's tax sale procedures, Mr. Voss, so I imagine you know that better than I do." Voss's expression did not change. $50, he said. That's a generous offer for a girl in your position. My position, Nora said, is that I am the legal owner of this property, and what is in it belongs to the people whose names are on the document that governs it, and I intend to see that it reaches them. Good morning, Mr. Voss. She went back inside and closed the great double door, which she had repaired and rehung on its hinges over the preceding week, and she listened to the sound of horses leaving, and she breathed very carefully for a while until her hands stopped shaking. It took 43 days. Cully Marsh knew a lawyer in Miles City, not a Haverford lawyer, not a man in Voss's orbit, a woman named Helen Pratt, which surprised nearly everyone in Caldwell Crossing who did not already know that Montana Territory had been admitting women to the bar since 1872. Helen Pratt rode out to the depot on a gray October morning and read every document Nora had, including the gray book and Crane's letter and the county deed, and she sat at the old dispatch table that Nora had cleaned and repaired and used as her desk, and she was quiet for a long time. "This is solid," she said finally. "The letter is clear, the ledger is corroborating, and the legal ownership of the funds is unambiguous. The Hargrove Company never held these funds in trust. Crane was acting outside his authority on behalf of private individuals. These are not company assets." She looked at Nora. "Voss will fight it." "I know," Nora said. "It will cost money to fight it." Nora looked at her steadily. "I know that, too. You don't have money." "I have a building," Nora said, "that I have been repairing for 6 weeks, and a forge, and a set of wheelwright's tools, and I can true a wheel as well as any man in this valley. And I have," she said, 11 people who are going to get their money back, and some of them may be willing to help." They were. The legal proceeding took 31 days. Voss's lawyers were good, but Helen Pratt was better, and the record Thomas Vane had kept in the gray book was the kind of documentary evidence that good lawyers dream about, specific, dated, corroborated, and kept by a man whose reputation for exactness was known to everyone in the valley who had known him. The judge, a circuit court judge from Billings who had seen enough of Voss's methods to have formed his own quiet opinion of the man, ruled clearly and without apparent reluctance that the funds belonged to the named individuals and their heirs, that the Hargrove Depot was the clear and unencumbered property of Nora Vane, and that the county had no claim, and neither did anyone else. Elias Voss did not appear in the courtroom for the ruling. He sent his lawyer, who accepted the judgment without comment and left quickly, and Voss himself was gone from Caldwell Crossing within 2 weeks. Not fled, exactly, not in any dramatic way, but relocated to Haverford and then reportedly to Cheyenne, which was a large enough city that a man with a briefcase and a calm expression could find other valleys to quietly disassemble. The valley did not miss him. The valley, in fact, exhaled. The distribution of the funds took place on a November afternoon in the repair depot on the Meridian Road, with Helen Pratt presiding and Cully Marsh witnessing, and 11 families, or the representatives of 11 families, in the cases where the original employees had died, receiving what had been held in the dark for 11 years. Nora watched each transaction, and she kept the record because she was her father's daughter, and she understood that a record honestly kept was a form of truth-telling, and she wrote each name and each amount in her own ledger with her own careful hand. The amounts were not fortunes. $300, $270, $185. But in a valley where Elias Voss had spent a decade making people feel that they had no options, the effect of each payment was something larger than its dollar figure. 2 families used the money to reclaim parcels Voss had taken. 3 families were able to clear debts that had been binding them to situations they had wanted to leave. Old Cully Marsh received his $310 and wept openly and without embarrassment. And when he collected himself, he looked at Nora and said, "Your father would be so proud of you, girl." And Nora, who had not cried once in the 43 days since she had found the iron ring in the stone floor, allowed herself a few minutes in the harness room, alone with the autumn light coming through a crack in the wall, before she came back out. She kept nothing for herself beyond what Crane's letter had specified, a $10 fee for the custodian of the vault, which Crane had apparently anticipated and included as a line item in his original instructions, with the particular foresight of a man who had understood that someone would have to do the work of making this right, and that labor deserves acknowledgement. $10. She thought her father would have laughed at the precision of it, and she allowed herself to smile. We began this story on a road at sundown, with a girl who had nothing, not a roof, not a name anyone would claim, not a single soul willing to meet her eye. $7.40 and a coat, and a dead man's book, and nowhere to go. We told you she walked into a county clerk's office and paid $5 for a crumbling depot that everyone in Caldwell Crossing agreed was the most foolish purchase a homeless child could make. We did not tell you at the beginning what we tell you now, that the foolishness was not hers. The foolishness had always belonged to the people who looked at Nora Vane and saw a girl with nothing, when what she was, in fact, was a girl with everything that actually mattered. Her father's careful mind, her father's honest hands, her father's gray book pressed against her ribs, and a capacity for patient, sequential thinking that could take a rotted floor apart board by board until it revealed what had been waiting underneath all along. By the following spring, the Hargrove Depot on the Meridian Road was operating as a way station and small freight office, with a repaired roof and new glass in the windows and a forge that worked, and Nora Vane had 4 regular customers for wheelwright work and a 5th negotiating terms. She had made the western corner into a room with a real door and a real stove, and she had put her father's 3 shelves of books on a new shelf she built herself from depot timber, and she had placed the gray book on the highest shelf where it would stay dry and safe. She was 17 years old. She had not forgotten what had been done to her. She had simply found, in the vault beneath the floor of a building that everyone had written off as worthless, that the world had a longer memory than Elias Voss had counted on, and that the thing about value, true value, is not that it disappears when people stop looking at it. It waits. It waits for the person willing to get down on their hands and knees in the dust and look at what is actually there. Thank you for spending this time with us today and for following this story all the way through to the end. It genuinely means a great deal to us that you are here. If this story found you at a moment when something in your own life feels overlooked or undervalued, we hope it offered some small measure of what Nora found in that cold stone vault. Not easy answers, but the quiet certainty that careful attention and honest work have a way of restoring what careless hands take away. If you'd like to share this video with someone who needs to hear a story like this one today, we would be honored. And before you go, we would love to know, what is a time in your own life when you found genuine value in something or someone that the world had written off? Leave your answer in the comments. We read every one. Until next time, stay close.